Hello everybody, thanks for coming. My name's Emily. I work with a group called the UK Tar Sands Network. Today we're going to try and address this question of can we shut down the world's most destructive industry and avoid climate chaos. We only have an hour and a quarter, so we won't probably get very far. But what I thought we would start with is about 20 to 25 minutes of me just reminding everyone what the tar sands are and why they're so bad and why we need to be focusing on them specifically as an issue. And then after that we're going to do some more kind of interactive activities that will get us thinking about how we might actually try and tackle this problem. So that's the plan. It would be really useful for me if we could just quickly go around and everyone just say your name if you're from a specific group or if you're just here as an individual, and just very briefly if you already know much about the tar sands or if you don't know anything, just so I know what everyone's hoping to get out of this session. So if that's, do you want to start?
Yes, my name is Andrew Bobbin. I'm an international human rights campaigner with an interest in Latin America because I have contacts there, and también yo hablo español.
My name is Bevis Gillett. I'm a supporter of the Green Movement, which I don't believe belongs to a specific organisation. I've seen a couple of the films on the tar sands, and I've read Jim Hanson's book, who said, you know, if we don't shut down the tar sands, game over, so that's why I'm here.
My name is Art Histerman. We are actually hope to be, well, it's Gauwagathon was in September, but they're now talking about January. In previous book which contains Rediscover Sustainability, which contains a certain amount of information also on this particular issue. I've read a couple of scientific papers about it, and I reasonably well know what the problem is.
Hello, I'm Barry Slipper from Southampton. Just an individual, member of numerous environmental groups. Know a bit about tar sands. I came to your meeting earlier on in the year when you had the delegates from Canada, Nigeria, etc. prior to the meeting in the Hague. But I'm keen to hear any updates.
Daniel Esterman, and I've been with CCC since it was formed pretty well. I can't do very much, but I can go out and protest.
I'm Annalisa Cavallini. I'm a member of the Energy, Equity and Environmental Group of Occupy London, and I've heard about tar sands before.
I'm John Whittaker from Gloucester. Been involved with CCC for about 8 years now. I also run a group called I Mind Time Help. I know a little about tar sands, but not enough.
Great.
I'm Ian Hogan. I'm representing a group called New Environmentalists. We don't know much about tar sands actually, but that's why I'm here to find out. I've been watching it in the media, but I like to get involved more with this.
Great.
I'm the same basically as a New Environmentalist. I read the articles in The Guardian and Independent, but I haven't seen more about tar sands. I know the basics, how destructive they are, the lobbying of the Canadian government, the UK one. Yeah, that's about it.
My name is Massimo, and like Chippy, I'm the same. I know pretty much the overall problem, following the media. But I'm here to find out more about tar sands, and I'm studying environmental management here at UCL.
My name is Lisa. I'm studying here at SOAS. My master's in economics, and yeah, I'm just interested to know more about the problem. I don't know very much about tar sands.
Yeah, my name is Boris, presenting this year for no more problem.
My name's Tony, ditto. I've been involved with CCC for about 4 years now.
I'm Frank, I'm with CCC as well. Know a bit about tar sands.
And you just
Right, so it's noted. So this is what we're doing now and how we can get involved, is that what it is?
Yeah, just wondering if you already know a lot about tar sands or what you're hoping to learn today.
Right, okay.
And your name.
My name's Stephen Platt, I come from Doncaster. I'm a member of the Green Party and I've been involved in a transition town. Right. what I've been meaning to do, and why I haven't done it already, was to get shares in the Royal Bank of Scotland, who I think are financing this, and go to their AGM, you know, and just play pop, more or less. Okay? The things that I've done with I've done that sort of thing with other companies.
Great. Do you want to just say your name and...
Susan Chapman.
Yeah, and we're just saying if people already know much about the Tar Sands or what they're hoping to do, just
Get online.
James Doncaster.
Great, okay. Well, that was useful just for me to know that people are hoping to learn a little bit more, so I don't just tell you things that you've already heard before. Yeah, so for those who came in late, I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes and then we're going to do some sort of more interactive sessions to get everyone thinking a bit more about the Tar Sands. So, what are the Tar Sands?
If you shut those lights off, it would be better.
Yeah.
The legend, but
That's better.
So there's basically 2 points that I want to get across about the Tar Sands. One is that the industry is immensely destructive, but also it's immensely huge. So it's not just the problem that it's bad, but it's the scale of how big this industry is that is really why we're concerned. So the tar sands themselves are really just a type of sort of sludgy, sandy, oily substance that can be turned into oil eventually with a huge amount of energy and huge expense and a huge cost to the environment. Usually when we say the tar sands, we mean the tar sands industry, not the sludgy product itself, when we say we're going to shut down the tar sands. And the reason that tar sands has started to become a huge concern to people these days is because for years it was just either impossible to extract this oil because nobody knew how to turn this solidy substance into oil, or it was too expensive once the technology was invented and no one had any incentive to do so. Recently, with conventional oil stocks running out and the price of oil getting much higher, it's suddenly become a lot more profitable and a lot of companies want in on this bit of money they can make from the tar sands. However, it's a hugely inefficient way of extracting oil. It basically uses more natural gas and water than any other way of getting oil out of the ground. So to power the tar sands takes the same amount of natural gas just to power the tar sands that you could use to heat 3.2 million Canadian households, providing all of their fuel and heat for their homes. And natural gas is running out in Canada, so the people are looking at how else it could be powered and thinking about building nuclear power plants to power the tar sands instead. In terms of water use, again, Canada is suffering with shortages of fresh water, and the tar sands take 2 to 5 barrels of water just to extract 1 barrel of oil. So it's an incredibly short-sighted way of trying to power our future. It's also incredibly toxic, produces a range of different carcinogenic contaminants and seeps into the water supply and poisons the food sources of the local people. So that's one example of a tumour found on a fish. There are all kinds of different ways that the chemicals are getting back into the food supply of the indigenous communities that live on this land. The animals are being killed, fish, ducks, wolves, caribou and moose, which are all what makes up a traditional subsistence diet for many of these communities. And it's also poisoning the rest of the land, including the medicines and the plants that are used by these communities as well. And it's obviously not because these communities have been consulted and decided that they wanted these projects to go ahead, but it's been a case of companies coming in and saying, we'd like to extract tar sands here, the government has said we can, we're going to do it anyway, we could perhaps offer you some jobs or a bit of money, what do you say? And in basically every situation, there's no choice, but the community has to go ahead and accept the offer, because if they say no, it'll happen anyway. So when I say the tar sands are huge, we're talking about an unprecedented scale. This is the largest single industrial project in history. The tar sands themselves take up an area the size of England, or 140,000 square kilometers, and they are in fact the third largest oil reserves in the world after Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. And the scale of destruction is just immense. I mean, it's devastating the entire ecosystem, not just a small patch of land. And the boreal forest that it's underneath is one of the most important carbon sinks on the planet. This is referred to sometimes as the second lung of the planet with the Amazon. So to wipe out huge tracts of boreal forest is just a double whammy for climate change, because extracting each barrel of oil already is 3 to 5 times more carbon intensive than extracting a regular barrel of oil. And the tar sands themselves, in total at the moment, currently produce about 1/3 of the emissions of the entire UK, just this single industrial project, or the equivalent of a country about the size of Denmark. And there is also this huge byproduct that's created of all these toxins that need to be disposed of somehow. So most of the time they're stored in these big industrial lakes called tailings ponds, which can be seen from space. They're so huge. And they leak at a rate of 11 million litres per day back into the river system. And these are filled with deadly chemicals that cause all kinds of cancers in the communities. There's also a different type of extraction method that doesn't create tailings ponds or surface mines, which is called SAGD, or Steam Assisted Gravity Drainage. And this is being touted by many oil companies now as the clean way to do tar sands. So companies like BP are bypassing the tailings ponds and surface mines and going entirely for SAGD development. This actually creates more carbon emissions and uses more fresh water, and still affects the land by disrupting the paths of animals, having to create loads of tracks through the forest, and it still pollutes the water, but instead of storing it in tailings ponds, it just ends up going underground and still getting back into the water supply. That we made when we were highlighting BP's involvement in the tar sands, which so far it's only just started, it's just confirmed its projects, it's developing it, it hasn't started making money off it yet. But this is an animation that really explains the issue of the tar sands quite simply. I think it's quite graphic, but it's quite effective at getting it across in a cartoon form. So I'm just going to briefly watch it and it goes for a minute. So BP is the Olympic Sustainability Partner. So that's a nice kind of light but grim way of understanding just how destructive it is. The kind of powering through the forest and everything dying, I think, is quite an accurate way of describing what the tar sands do. So the future of tar sands extraction is probably the scariest part of all of this, because it's not just what we're seeing at the moment, but it's expected to double and even triple in the next few years. So at the moment, I think we've got about 2.1 million barrels per day being extracted, and we're looking at 5 million barrels per day by 2030. And there's a reason that it's expanding this quickly, which is that the Canadian and Alberta governments have 100% rate of approval for any projects so far. I mean, that's not their policy, but it just kind of turns out that way. Every time someone says, I'd like to extract some tar sands here, they say, great. And, I mean, yeah, you might think that we're starting to realize now that because of climate change, we need to start scaling back these kinds of industries, but not the case, actually. We're seeing things like expanding markets. So if there isn't enough of a demand in just the US, which currently takes about 98% of the Canadian tar sands, so it needs to go further afield. So this is the current pipeline network, and we're seeing projected increases, so it can get out to different parts of the country. That's 2015. And that's 2030, so we're going to need more pipelines to feed in more gas to power the tar sands. Then we want it to go out to the west coast so it can be exported to China, down the south so it can be exported to other parts of the world like South America and Europe. So that's what's on the cards for government and industry. And we're basically, oh yeah, and at the same time then, around the world, other deposits of tar sands are being discovered. And in these places, the environmental and human rights legislation, believe it or not, is actually worse than in Canada. And they're going to be following the example of Canada. They're going to be using the same technologies, and some of these aren't exactly the same substance. Like the oil in Venezuela is not quite so dense. It's called heavy oil, it's extra heavy oil, but it relies on much the same technology, has much the same impact on the environment and on the climate. And if all of these places become fully productive, then we're just going to see skyrocketing carbon emissions. The Canadian government likes to say we're a responsible developer of oil, and it's much better to go to us than to some country like Saudi Arabia where they abuse people's human rights. And in Canada, we do everything ethically, and we're working on how we can make the industry more sustainable. And we've already done lots of things to improve it, and we're getting more efficient. However, there just is no green way to extract the tar sands. And so one example of this is if you look at the plan of Alberta or of Canada, both governments have their own climate change plan. They involve things like carbon trading or carbon capture and storage. In the case of carbon capture and storage, the technology, as you would know, is not particularly advanced, and when it comes to tar sands, I think it's even less likely to work than it is for things like coal, where they've actually done more research in how it would work. And I think in the case of tar sands, there's only a 10% likelihood that they'd be able to stop emissions from the plant anyway. So it really is a very, very vague approach to dealing with climate change, yet that's all the Alberta and Canadian governments have. And so they're quite willing to tell the people in the world, don't worry, we've got it sorted, it's getting greener and greener every year. Even if it is getting greener every year, which, we're talking minuscule improvements, the doubling and tripling of the industry means that if it's improving by 1% or 2% in each project, we're still going to see huge increases in climate change and carbon emissions. So effectively, they're kind of spinning the line that it's getting greener, but that in reality is of no help to anybody. And this is just one way of looking at it in terms of what tar sands means for climate change. If we want to try and stop runaway climate change and get the level of carbon emissions equivalent down to 350 parts per million, we basically can only afford to emit 900 billion more tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions. And the tar sands themselves would emit 11% of that. So that would mean the entire globe for the next 100 years would have used up 11% of all of its emissions it could use for anything just by extracting the tar sands. And yet the tar sands themselves would only power a tiny percent of our energy use anyway. It would make up about 10% of vehicle use, but not help in any of the other things that we need, like electricity. Sorry, is there a question?
Yeah, when you say you say that in order to keep within 350 ppm.
Yeah.
We've already passed. We're already at
to get back to 350 by 2100. Sorry, I didn't make that clear. So it's saying that everything else that we're doing already.
How does that get you back to 350? I don't see that at all, because to get back to 350, you've got to take carbon out of the atmosphere. So that would seem to involve a whole lot of other questions that are completely very difficult to answer, to talk about that kind of thing.
Yeah, so this research has come from the Trillionth Ton group at Oxford University. I can talk to you about it more at the end, but in my understanding it's saying that in order to get back to 350, we basically need to reduce carbon emissions as much as possible, as soon as possible, and
yes.
Obviously the only emissions that we will be able to make have to be such that they can be countered by all of the natural sequestration from forests and things that can suck it back. So it's kind of saying that this is like that we can ever emit, to make sure that we are sucking it back out at the same, faster than we can ever emit it.
Just because a more typical figure that you get is that's how much the percentage to keep the temperature to 2 degrees, for instance, that I'm familiar with. But that involves at least a few less enormously difficult questions to answer.
Yeah, I think this was created to counter the claim that people had made that tar sands would only contribute 0.01 degrees of temperature rise or something, and people thought, oh, that doesn't sound like much when you compare it to 2 or 3 degrees temperature rise. So they came up with this other way of looking at it, to just say it's still a huge portion of what we could ever emit. But yeah, it's just another way of looking at it, I suppose. So what can we do about this? And that's where I'm just going to briefly explain some of the campaigns that are going on in different parts of the world to try and stop the tar sands. So the group I'm with is the UK Tar Sands Network. We're focusing on what the UK can do to cut our involvement with the tar sands. And this is looking at things like UK oil companies, BP and Shell, attacking a lot of their sponsorship and the way that they continue to create a social license to operate by appearing to be friendly green oil companies, especially with BP's claim to be sustainability partner of the Olympics. We're doing other things around the lobbying between the UK government and the Canadian government, and their attempts to slow or block the Fuel Quality Directive, which would be a one way to discourage tar sands from being imported to the UK and Europe. We've also worked with Indigenous groups in Canada in solidarity with legal claims. So in this case of one community, the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, is suing Shell for its past violations of their agreements to operate on its land. So campaigning in solidarity with Indigenous groups is very important, we think, from our perspective, to try and make sure that we take direction from them, so we don't end up doing things that would be counter to their aims. Several other things that we're doing. One of them is a company called Valero that not many people have heard of. They've actually stated the aim of importing tar sands directly to the UK. And they've recently bought into the Texaco refinery. It used to be in Pembrokeshire in Wales. It's now been bought by.
Could you give us that name again?
Yes. I don't have a pen. Anyway, I'll just tell you. Valero, V-A-L-E-R-O. I've got some.
Like the Dawn dance that people do.
Is it?
Yes.
So V-E-L-O.
V-A-L-E-R-O. So Valero is a refining company, and they've recently bought the refinery in Pembrokeshire that used to be owned by Chevron, and they've also bought all kinds of different bits of infrastructure, oil terminals and depots around the UK and Ireland, and all of the petrol stations that have Texaco branding on them are now owned by Valero. And
So they're going to bring the actual sludge into, where is it, Pembrokeshire?
what we're not clear on is whether they would refine it first in the US and then export it in the form of oil, or if they would just bring it over here and then refine it. They also haven't publicly said that this is their intention, but we've seen an investor presentation that they gave last year which demonstrated that this would be their strategy, and this was the reason that they bought up all of this infrastructure in the UK, because up until this point they'd only owned refineries in the US and Canada. But they said that this optimizes their strategy because it gives them an opening into the European market to start exporting some tar sands oil.
With a name like Valero, or Canada, that would be a Spanish company or a Latin American company, wouldn't it?
They have some operations in Latin America, but they're mainly from the US.
From the US.
You said Chevron, was it Chevron and Louisiana?
So Chevron used to own the refinery and it sold it to Valero. And Chevron also used to own all of the Texaco petrol stations, which have now also been sold to Valero. This is just a new area of our work that we've been trying to do some more research and find out about this, because if all things go according to plan, the Fuel Quality Directive should be stopping this kind of thing from happening. But it's obviously not gone through yet. It's been facing delay after delay, mainly because of the Canadian government lobbying.
Will the legislation stop it, or is just the branding, from what I understand, it's just going to say this word is more
Yeah,
polluting
you're
than
right.
this word, but it's not going to stop you using it.
It's not going to ban you from using it, but it will act as a disincentive, because a company will need to show that it is meeting the climate emissions reduction targets of the EU. So if it's going to operate within the EU and meet those targets, it will have to accept that this oil is more polluting and therefore it can't use so much of it, and it will make more sense to use a less polluting oil.
So just went to clarification, going back to that huge increase in oil produced from the tar sands, were any of the other tar sand oil deposits factored into that, or is that just the Alberta, Athabasca?
That's just Alberta, yeah.
And have you looked at the potential for the other tar sand deposits? I mean, what will that be going into the future? Perhaps that's something you're going to cover anyway.
That's not something I was going to cover. We released a report about that last year. But to be honest, all of those are still very much in early stages of exploration. They don't necessarily know how much oil is there. They haven't really started extracting them, other than in Venezuela, which is on
Quite
the
a
scale.
significant activity going on in the northern US itself.
In
the United States.
Yeah, in Utah as well, they've found tar sands there. So certainly lots of different places. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head.
In terms of the gas used to extract the oil, what is the kind of ratio in terms of carbon emission?
What, in terms of how much would be emitted if they just used the gas rather than use the gas to power the tar sands to make the oil?
Typically, we're finding what with unconventional gas, fracking, consumes an appreciable amount of energy in its production compared to the energy you get from using the product.
Yeah, you're right. I think the figure is something like, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it is something like in barrels of oil equivalent that you put in. With normal oil extraction, if you put in 1 barrel of oil, you get the equivalent of 50 or 100 barrels of oil in return. Whereas in this case, it's something like you put in 1 barrel of oil, you get 2 barrels of oil back. So it's something like that. That the huge amount of energy needs to be put into it to get anything back.
But that's a very important figure to have to at your fingertips.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that, and then you need to compare that with other means of gas and oil extraction. Because ultimately there's going to have to be a tax based on the carbon emissions associated with the whole process, from well or excavation or whatever it is, the point of extraction. tank when it's actually used, or a power station or whatever. And when that's taken into account, if there's enough tax, it will be a big disincentive for the more efficient ways of extraction. So that will become a self-regulating system. It's just we've got to put this tax into place.
Sounds like a good idea.
But if the oil companies and the and so on know that this tax is coming, then they would change their investment priorities and put more money into the cleaner ways of extracting oil and gas. So that's why we need desperately to have a proper tax regime. And Phil says that, points out that we've actually got to bring down the CO2 in the atmosphere. So the logical thing is to use that tax money, that tax revenue, to pay to put the CO2 back in the ground, using things like biochar and rock crushing is another way of doing it cheaply. You can use artificial trees to put CO2 in the ground, but that's relatively expensive way of doing it. If we put enough effort into putting CO2 back in the ground, that could be paid for out of relatively modest tax. And if the oil companies then accepted that that was going to be done across the board, so that there's no question of a competitive advantage, they would change their investment priorities. And then you find things that are just sort of very inefficient, like coal.
We're going to have the discussion at the end.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Finish, and then we can have the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I didn't know.
That's a whole can of worms in itself, because before we can get onto a tax, I think we need to stop the subsidies that are going to these industries first. So, but I mean, that's definitely, that's definitely one way that we could try and address the problem. I've just got one more slide, and then then we can break down into groups and carry on the discussion. No, that's totally fine. There was one more hand. Was that related to this current?
I took alcohol.
Okay.
Are there any other banks involved besides Royal Bank of Scotland?
Oh yeah, every bank is involved. There's a so in the UK, all of the high street banks that you would think of, HSBC.
Not the Co-op Bank.
Not the Co-op. No. The Co-op campaigned against the tar sands, and they support the Beagle Lake Cree lawsuit.
And is it Shell as well as BP?
Shell have been in there for years and years, and actually, I think they own a fifth of all tar sands operations now. And of their own operations, something like 30% of what they do is tar sands. So Shell are very involved. I've got lots of literature out in the stalls outside, which go through the different finances, ranking them. RBS is the top UK investor, but all of them are on the list. So this final slide is just showing some other kinds of resistance that are happening in different parts of the world. So we've got in this corner here, it's the Keystone XL protest, which was huge last year. The Keystone XL pipeline would take oil from the tar sands down through 6 US states down to the Gulf Coast, where apparently it would be used in the US, but everybody knew that it was an export pipeline and it would be taking the tar sands abroad. And these protests were very successful in getting this issue on the agenda. It became a bit of an election issue for Obama, and he delayed it so that he wouldn't have to make a decision about it. And it's then been continuously pushed back by the company that's trying to get it done, which is TransCanada. They just keep coming up with different ways to get it in. The Republicans keep linking it with other bills that have nothing to do with climate change and kind of bribing the Democrats and saying, we won't vote for your tax break for working class families unless you will support the Keystone XL pipeline. And then just recently they agreed to build the bottom portion of it anyway, So they said, we're going to come back to the question of the whole pipeline later, but in the meantime, let's just build the bottom half of it. And I mean, that becomes...
Meaning what?
Sorry?
What's the bottom half?
It's from Oklahoma to Texas.
Oh, I see.
So it doesn't actually go to the tar sands, but there's already, you know, other pipelines that would take it to Oklahoma. So, I mean, the reason that this is such an important campaign is because if we can stop the pipelines that would take the oil away from Alberta, then they would have to eventually slow the rate of extraction because there wouldn't be anyone to sell the oil to. At the same time, a similar campaign is going on against the Enbridge pipeline, which would take oil west out towards Vancouver and to the west coast of British Columbia and eventually export it to China. The process there has been made up of hundreds of different First Nations that have all come together to say we will not let this pipeline be built on our territory. And as ever, it's been fraught with difficulty. The Canadian government has come out and said that anyone that opposes this pipeline is a foreign extremist radical, and they're pushing a narrow environmental agenda, and they're trying to stop our country having jobs and economic growth. And at the moment, they're in consultation with the different communities, and a few of them have agreed to have some share in it, but it's hardly any. I mean, it's 1% or something, whereas the company keeps saying that it's about 50%, 60% of communities have accepted a stake in the deal, but that's just not the case.
They circled the White House, didn't they? Thousands of them circled the White House and held hands, I think.
They did it in the Keystone process, yeah. We did a miniature version in London where we built a little White House and we stood around it in solidarity. And then this is just a different kind of campaign that's going on in the US, which is about stopping individual companies from using tar sands oil in their own supply chain. So this was one...
about the pipeline business, was Jim Hansen involved in that?
Probably, yeah. He's involved in...
he was arrested. He was arrested.
Oh,
He
yeah.
managed to get himself arrested, which is
Well, this
probably
was-
the best publicity you could get in the world.
Well, this was, yeah, I mean, I didn't explain that in that much detail, but the process involved, at the height of the process, was 2 weeks of continuous sit-ins in front of the White House, and every day the people would get arrested, and in total 1,253 people got arrested. And that was really what raised the profile of the issue.
Funny how our big media didn't report on it. I didn't see it in the news, did you? Must see like it in one of the emails.
Who was in the Guardian?
Oh, was it? Oh, well,
That's it.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, the BBC wasn't there.
And then we've also, so this is just a different campaign, which is just saying, individual companies don't use tar sands oil in your trucks and in all of your supply chain. There's other work being done by other First Nations that are taking lawsuits against these companies. The Beaver Lake Cree is one of the really famous examples at the moment. There's also the one I said earlier about the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. And these could be really groundbreaking if they win, then this can hopefully set some kind of precedent for other companies not wanting to risk this sort of litigation and therefore, considering it as more of a financial and legal risk rather than at the moment just going in because they can't see any problem. And similar to that, there is also work going on just engaging with shareholder activism, companies like BP and Shell trying to get resolutions passed by the shareholders to highlight at least that there ought to be more review of the risks from a financial point of view involved before these companies start going into the tar sands. And that relates to the point about companies preparing for there to be a tax or something like that, because obviously if the companies were looking ahead at likely impacts of climate legislation, then they might think twice about getting involved in such carbon-intense industries. And one other thing I didn't mention about our own campaigning is that we're also working on creating a network of groups in the UK that are actively opposing the tar sands. We call that tar-free towns, so that towns or communities of different types around the country can feel supported to take action against tar sands and local targets in their area. We worked with a group in Lewis of the constituency of Norman Baker, who is the politician who was responsible for choosing the UK's position on the Fuel Quality Directive. So working with that community from a local level. We've also started working with the community in Pembrokeshire and Wales that are going to be on the doorstep of this potential tar sands arriving in the UK at the local refinery. And one final thing is that we've got a lovely big poster out there. If any of you were here yesterday and you heard Danny Chivers talk, he may have mentioned this, but we've been working on an idea of the future of fuels, two futures. We don't have to have oil, there are alternatives, and we've made this big graphic visual representation of showing that we could actually, with current technology, get by without oil, and we don't need to use the tar sands. And every time that BP and Shell and the Canadian government say, this is only a stopgap before we get renewables going, which is what they like to say, but we say, no, actually, we could just use renewables now. We have the technology, and this is how it would look. So yeah, later if you want to come out there and have a look at that image, it can be quite an inspiring one to get you going. Yeah, so that's all. So I will take some more questions now, and then I'd like everyone to get into some smaller groups and have some discussions. So yeah.
This is a good one. I've read somewhere that there was a large tar sands deposit in Syria, which you didn't have on your map, and that Shell were finally forced out of Syria with the groundswell of international opinion against what was going on there. But it took a long time, and were really supportive of the current regime in oppressing the people there because of the tar sands interest. And they finally had to withdraw support and pull out. But I mean, that process of other reasons.
Was it definitely tar sands, or might it have been shale oil?
I'm pretty sure it was tar sands,
Okay.
because I made the connection with Shell in Canada.
Okay, yeah, I mean that wasn't an exhaustive map, but that was certainly the largest deposits that we'd found in other parts of the world. But in the New Internationalist, I think we also, there was something that covered Syria as well.
I mean, they really seem to be just quickly, having attended your meeting earlier on in the year and heard what they're doing in other parts of the world, in Nigeria. They're really, they need to shout bastards, yes. That's the only way to put it, disgraceful.
That's first of all a point of information. At the moment, oil prices are falling. The two main reasons for that are the way the people who manage the current economy have managed to achieve zero growth. And the other is that, rightly or wrongly, the largest remaining deposit of easily accessible conventional oil, the Kirkuk field in northern Iraq, has come on stream. That is producing a large amount of conventional oil. I've also comment about the alternative. The British government is at the moment pressing for cracking sand deposits, shale deposits containing methane. That's as dirty as there is a problem there also with emissions. Normally, emissions administratively are handled by the end use, but in the case of the shale gas, it is largely methane. And for sure, a fair amount of it will get in the atmosphere. You start to use explosives to get it out. The unconventional gas in this country is as dirty as the tar sands. That's all I want to say on that point.
You're right. Okay, I'll go 1, 2, 3.
Can you tell us more about the second method of storage for the waste? Because I think they're advertising that as a cleaner alternative to the huge lakes that you can see from space. This is probably stored in the ground, but can you tell us how? Just expand a bit more on how
unfortunately, I don't really have a lot of detail about that, but I've got lots of resources about it out
because
on the
that's
store.
one of the reasons why BP and Shell now turn around and said, well, actually, look, it's going to be really clean. You won't be able to see it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not going to be clean.
Yeah.
And as I say, much more carbon emissions are coming from it. I don't know a lot of detail. I mean, I think it's to do with, it's just storing the contaminated water somehow underground and not putting it in big lakes. But yeah, sorry, I don't know very much about that.
Yes, there is something that I do know, which unfortunately we cannot do much about. is known as an Acuerdo de las Manos, or in English a gentleman's agreement. And basically what happens, a senior representative of a transnational company goes to a Latin American country, finds a government official that he can trust, and they go into a coffee shop, and the transnational representative lays a nice proposition out on the table, and he says to the government official, I've got a nice proposition for you. I think we can share $1 billion US together if you can persuade your government to allow us to start exploration in your country to extract tar sands. And the government official obviously cannot resist an offer like this, and he says, oh, okay, yes, I'll take this up with my government. I think that should be okay for you. But in Latin America, the rule simply goes out the window. There's no rules in Latin America.
Yeah, unfortunately it's not that dissimilar in Canada as well. Was there over here?
Yeah, I have one question about biodiversity. I don't know if I'm sorry I missed the film, so I don't know if you covered that much then, but obviously I've seen the photographs about the devastation of the forests, and I know that there's a real loss of biodiversity globally, and that's quite a really important issue. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about biodiversity loss, if you know anything about that.
I don't, unfortunately, but I know that I have heard people say it is very bad for biodiversity, just because it doesn't just destroy one small area, but the entire ecosystem of that area. So yeah, wiping out whole areas and just digging up all of the life. But I don't know in any detail.
What's the difference between tar oil and the other thing that's produced in the sea, the shale?
Shale oil?
Yes.
Shale oil comes from rock, basically, and even harder substance, whereas tar sands is a kind of sludgy, gooey sand.
But they both pollute the environment in the same way, don't they?
Basically, yes.
As you mentioned before, that we need to push forward for a system of taxation of the environmental impact of tar extraction, so to force the government then to reduce the impact and so on. But it's been mentioned that biodiversity, tar sands got two problems. It's got massive CO2 emissions because of the production processes, but then it's a biodiversity destruction. And there isn't any way to put a tax on biodiversity extraction. And that's, I think, the main problem is tar sand extraction the world is facing with. Because at one point you can tax against emission, but you can't tax against biodiversity extraction. Nobody's discussing about it.
You can tax the removal of forest.
I mean, the other thing is that
you have to put a carbon figure on.
Yeah, but what about polluting the water streams? What about polluting the water reservoir that then go into the...
I mean, yeah, people are looking at ways to just stop it completely, because we know that just counting figures of carbon emissions doesn't solve the problem. Especially as the companies like to say that they will restore the area after they finish using it. And they have this great example of the one successful area that's been restored. And I haven't visited it myself, but apparently it's just a kind of paddock between all of these tar sands mines, and there's a few bison on there looking a bit sick. And they say, look, this is an example of us turning the land back into functional forests again, and we know that isn't going to work at all, so you're right.
So if we can't stop them, and then the way to go is taxation to force them to be more environmental friendly, I think the movement needs to take into consideration the way to find forcing authorities and governments also to start with a tax on biodiversity loss.
I think just before we kind of break into discussion, that I think we're all kind of aware of all of these things that we need to change, that we need you know, we need a tax, we need biodiversity taken into account, all of these things, but quite often we get stuck at the point of what can we actually do about it as individuals, because, you know, even if we did come up with a perfect plan, that doesn't necessarily mean that it will get implemented. And one example of that is the Ecocide campaign, which has come up with a great way of getting all of these problems stopped, is by just declaring this a case of ecocide, making ecocide a law against the peace, international crime against the peace, and having the UN uphold that like it would crimes of genocide and things. And, you know, so that's one really good way of doing it, but until that actually happens and that actually becomes implemented, then quite often, you know, we don't really feel like we can do much. So I think it'd be really useful if we could break into groups.
Last question.
Very quickly, yes.
The Fuel Quality Directive. And I don't know a lot about it, but my understanding is that law should block tar sands oil coming in because it's outside the parameters of the directive. But crude oil, tar sands oil comes in as a crude oil that needs to be refined. So if it comes in already as a crude oil, how the Fuel Quality Directive can stop it? Because at the end of the day, it's just crude oil. The emissions happens outside the EU. EU can legislate on emissions in Canada, arises as a crude oil, then completely overturn the law.
I mean, it's talking about the life cycle emissions, so they have to say that fuel came from here in its entire life cycle.
But how anyone can legislate on fuel coming from Canada if the company is an offshore company importing it? I don't understand.
Because the product is still used in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, so this is why it's been so difficult to get this passed, because it's really controversial, and countries like Canada keep saying you can't discriminate against oil from our country. But they're saying, well, we're not. We're just saying that if a UK company wants to sell this oil, it has to be able to show that in its life cycle it has been X level of emissions.
There is an issue about this which I'd like to discuss. Shall I leave that now, or?
Well, I think it would be really useful if we could just kind of move the chairs just into about 3 groups, and we can just start discussing some of the issues that people can actually start to do. Because I know when I go to sessions like this, I often come away feeling really depressed that there's just all of these problems and there's nothing kind of productive that we can do about it. So I just thought it would be really useful. We've got like 15 minutes left, so if we could just move the chairs into small circles and then we can just start to discuss. The question that I actually thought would be good to discuss was, if you had £1 million and you wanted to run a campaign against the tar sands, what would you actually do? And how would you start to get all of these ideas that we're having to be heard by the right people and be moved forward in the right direction? Because as a campaigning organisation, you know, we know what we need to do, kind of maybe a bit. Like, we need to stop the tar sands, we need to change the frame of the debate from being about just the carbon emissions to about, you know, the whole destruction and the fact that the industry shouldn't continue. But how do we actually get to the point that happens? So if we can just move the chairs and have a discussion, and then maybe at the end, if we have time, we can, you know, feed back any really good ideas that have come up.
Anyone have any more experience?
No, but it's by thinking like this that we get ideas of what we could do if we have £10,000. We might one day have £100,000. People would like to go out and say, so they're having problems.
So if we had £1 million, or I could think of this, you know, media stuff,
Canadian products
costs a lot of money, so
to get the money back. It doesn't actually work.
it would serve you as a budget. £1 million helps buy 2 shares.
EU law, you already in action within Europe, and Europe is the system The EU works by having people lobbying,
usually not to give reasons like
and you have to be a specific lobbyist in order to one will have to get some methods of getting people caring with this, general public. The other thing is the biggest argument people mention that we individually can't do, but not even on government councils have their forms saying Europe as a whole is a big issue, big say, and we should be looking at ways of utilising the lobbying system.
And that's why the ridiculous argument of I've seen
in other
parts. They're saying you can't let foreign stream environmental companies go oil, but have to sell it to China. But I think you're right, that is always going to be difficult. We're not trying to make
but not for the emissions of greenhouse gases.
I think the EU in terms of just what I've read, the EU regulations including this fuel directive, we're trying to get to
That's as far away.
But I'd like to hear ideas about what we would actually do about this.
I think it was something was mentioned, but it's
with the emissions that there are, we're trying to just use things to show down the line emissions in production. So if it is down the line, this directive makes you clear that the two different venues, and there is a way to get around it. Yeah, they were saying that if they do a lot of refinery, they don't get away with it because by the time it gets to us. But this directive is definitely from the source.
There's that sort of thing. So there's pressure. There is a certain amount of pressure. So I think in that way, I don't know. But some of the policy, certainly policy.
Funnily enough, in Alberta, they've got a huge look how big this trucks are, and you go to Wilson, it's got a reason. Yeah, like, I mean, it's not